June 19, 1944, 0730 hours, 140 miles west of Guam. Captain Ralph Jennings stood on the bridge of USS Lexington, designated CV-16, watching his flight deck transform into controlled chaos. Flight deck crews in color-coded jerseys swarmed across the wooden planking. Yellow shirts guided aircraft from hangar elevators to launch positions. Blue shirts chained down aircraft awaiting their turn. Red shirts armed weapons. Green shirts checked catapults and arresting gear. Purple shirts managed fuel lines, snaking across the deck like industrial arteries. The morning air already shimmered with heat and aviation fuel vapors. The Lexington, an Essex-class carrier commissioned just 18 months earlier, was preparing to launch what would become the largest single-deck strike in naval aviation history to that point. 103 aircraft, Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers, all from one ship, all within 2 hours. 15 miles to the north, Vice Admiral Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet from the carrier Taiho. His flagship, the newest and largest carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, displaced 29,000 tons. Her armored flight deck represented the pinnacle of Japanese carrier design. Her air group, when fully embarked, numbered 75 aircraft, but on this morning, Taiho carried only 63 operational aircraft. This was not due to battle damage. This was her maximum sustainable air group given available pilots, mechanics, and spare parts. Ozawa did not know that 15 miles away, a single American carrier was preparing to launch more aircraft than his entire flagship could carry. The mathematics of this disparity would define the engagement that followed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would demonstrate not just American numerical superiority, but a fundamental difference in how the two nations conceived of carrier aviation itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The revelation would reshape American understanding of industrial warfare. One Essex-class carrier, of which America would build 24 during the war, could project more air power than Japan's finest purpose-built fleet carrier. The implications extended far beyond this single engagement. They revealed that American carrier doctrine, American industrial capacity, and American approach to naval aviation had diverged so completely from Japanese thinking that the two navies were essentially fighting different kinds of war. Japanese confidence in carrier aviation had been earned through a decade of innovation and combat success. The Imperial Japanese Navy had pioneered carrier operations in the 1930s, developing doctrine and tactics that made their carrier forces the most formidable in the world by 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated Japanese carrier aviation at its peak. 6 carriers launched 183 aircraft in the first wave, followed by 167 in the second wave. The strikes achieved complete tactical surprise, sinking 4 battleships and damaging 4 more, while destroying 188 American aircraft on the ground. The operation validated Japanese carrier doctrine built around concentrated striking power, delivered with precision timing. Through the first year of the Pacific War, Japanese carriers dominated every engagement. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, carrier aircraft from Kaga and Akagi provided air superiority that allowed Japanese surface forces to destroy Allied naval forces attempting to defend the Dutch East Indies. At Ceylon in April 1942, Japanese carriers struck British bases and sank the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes, along with 2 cruisers. Japanese carrier operations appeared unstoppable. Their pilots were the finest naval aviators in the world, with many veterans having logged over 3,000 hours of flight time and extensive combat experience from operations in China. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, outperformed American equivalents in speed, maneuverability, and range. Their doctrine emphasized coordinated strikes that overwhelmed defensive capabilities through sheer concentration of force. But the foundation of Japanese carrier power was narrower than it appeared. Japan entered the war with 10 carriers operational or near completion. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Ryujo, Hosho, Zuiho, and Shoho. These carriers represented 15 years of focused development and enormous investment. But Japanese industrial capacity could not rapidly replace losses or expand the carrier force significantly during wartime. American carrier construction followed a completely different trajectory. When war began in December 1941, the United States had 7 carriers in service: Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet. Within 4 years, American shipyards would add over 100 carriers of various types to the fleet. The disparity was not in initial strength, but in industrial capacity to expand that strength during sustained warfare. The Essex class program began in July 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, when the Navy awarded contracts for the first 4 ships of the class. The program reflected American strategic thinking about future naval warfare. Carriers would need to project power across vast Pacific distances. They would need to sustain operations for months without returning to port. They would need to absorb battle damage and remain operational. They would need to embark air groups large enough to conduct offensive operations while defending themselves from air attack. The Essex design specifications revealed American priorities: standard displacement of 27,100 tons, length of 872 feet, beam of 147 feet at the flight deck, maximum speed of 33 knots, range of 20,000 nautical miles at 15 knots, crew complement of 2,600 officers and enlisted personnel, air group capacity of 90 to 100 aircraft depending on type mix. These specifications were not theoretical. They were calculated based on operational requirements identified through war games and strategic planning conducted throughout the 1930s. American naval theorists understood that Pacific warfare would require sustained operations across distances measured in thousands of miles. Carriers would need endurance to operate for extended periods without resupply. They would need large air groups to conduct offensive strikes while maintaining defensive patrols. They would need capacity to embark spare aircraft and replacement pilots. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex, designated CV-9, was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941. Construction proceeded with remarkable speed. The hull was launched on July 31, 1942, just 15 months after the keel was laid. The ship was commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. From keel laying to commissioning took 20 months. This construction speed would prove typical for the class. The second Essex-class carrier, USS Yorktown, designated CV-10, was laid down at Newport News on December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor. She was commissioned on April 15, 1943, 16 months later. The name honored the carrier Yorktown, sunk at Midway in June 1942. The rapid construction meant the new Yorktown joined the fleet less than a year after her predecessor was lost. USS Intrepid, designated CV-11, followed even faster. Laid down December 1, 1941, the same day as Yorktown, she was commissioned August 16, 1943, 20 months later. USS Hornet, CV-12, laid down August 3, 1942, commissioned November 29, 1943, 15 months later. The construction pace accelerated as shipyards refined their processes and as subcontractors delivered components with increasing efficiency. By mid-1943, American shipyards were completing one Essex-class carrier approximately every 6 to 8 weeks. This production rate exceeded anything in naval history. No nation had ever built fleet carriers at this pace. No nation had ever committed the industrial resources necessary to sustain such construction rates while simultaneously building battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and merchant vessels by the hundreds. The industrial organization required to achieve this construction rate was as impressive as the ships themselves. Newport News Shipbuilding and Bethlehem Steel's Four Rivers Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, served as primary construction sites. Norfolk Navy Yard and Philadelphia Navy Yard provided additional capacity. Each yard employed tens of thousands of workers operating around the clock in shifts that never stopped. Welding arcs lit the night. Cranes moved components weighing hundreds of tons. Assembly lines produced standardized components that could be installed on any ship in the class. Standardization was crucial to the program's success. Every Essex-class carrier used identical propulsion machinery. 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines delivering 150,000 shaft horsepower. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers generating steam at 600 pounds per square inch. 4 propeller shafts. This standardization meant that maintenance procedures, spare parts, and operator training were identical across the entire class. A machinist's mate trained on Essex could transfer to Lexington and immediately understand every system. The same standardization extended throughout the ship. Electrical systems used identical switchboards and distribution panels. Damage control equipment was interchangeable. Communications gear followed standard configurations. Even the flight deck layout was standardized, with catapults, arresting gear, and aircraft elevators positioned identically on every ship. This standardization dramatically reduced training time and simplified logistics. Replacement parts could be manufactured in massive quantities and distributed throughout the fleet without customization for individual ships. Japanese carrier construction followed completely different principles. Each Japanese carrier was essentially unique. Akagi began life as a battlecruiser, converted to a carrier under the Washington Naval Treaty limitations. Her flight deck configuration reflected compromises forced by her origins as a surface combatant. Kaga similarly began as a battleship hull, converted to a carrier in 1928. Her design incorporated lessons learned from Akagi but remained constrained by her battleship origins. Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built fleet carriers commissioned in the late 1930s, represented Japanese carrier design at its finest. Soryu displaced 15,900 tons and could embark 57 aircraft. Hiryu, slightly larger at 17,300 tons, carried 64 aircraft. These ships incorporated Japanese experience from a decade of carrier operations. But each was a unique design, built to different specifications, with different machinery arrangements and different operational characteristics. Shokaku and Zuikaku, commissioned in 1941, were the finest carriers Japan would produce during the pre-war period. 25,000 tons displacement. Capacity for 72 aircraft. Speed of 34 knots. Range of 9,700 nautical miles. These carriers represented the culmination of Japanese carrier development, but only 2 were built. Japanese industrial capacity could not produce more while simultaneously building battleships like Yamato and Musashi. This meant that when Japanese carriers were lost in combat, they could not be quickly replaced. After Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, the replacements took years to complete. Taiho, laid down in July 1941, was not commissioned until March 1944, nearly 3 years later. Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, required even longer. Her construction consumed resources equivalent to building multiple smaller carriers. The mathematical implications were devastating for Japanese naval strategy. America could lose carriers and replace them within months. Japan lost carriers and faced years before replacements became operational. This asymmetry meant that American forces could fight aggressively, accepting losses that would be quickly replaced. Japanese forces needed to preserve their carriers because losses could not be replaced during wartime. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 demonstrated this dynamic with brutal clarity. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in a single day. These 4 carriers represented 1/3 of Japan's operational carrier strength and approximately 40% of its fleet carrier tonnage. American losses totaled 1 carrier, Yorktown. The exchange rate was catastrophic for Japan, but the aftermath revealed the true disparity. USS Enterprise and Hornet, the 2 American carriers that survived Midway, continued operations throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. They were joined by USS Saratoga returning from repairs and by USS Wasp transferred from the Atlantic. By August 1942, American carrier strength in the Pacific had actually increased, despite Midway losses. Japan's 4 lost carriers were not replaced. Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged at the Coral Sea, required months of repairs. Japanese carrier strength declined immediately after Midway and remained depressed throughout 1942 and into 1943. The first Essex-class carrier, CV-9 Essex, arrived in the Pacific in May 1943. She joined Task Force 58, conducting strikes against Marcus Island. The second, Yorktown CV-10, followed in August. Lexington CV-16 arrived in September. Intrepid joined in December. By early 1944, 6 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific, with more arriving monthly. Each Essex-class carrier that arrived increased American striking power by margins that Japanese forces could not match. A single Essex could embark 90 to 100 aircraft. Japanese fleet carriers embarked 60 to 75 aircraft when fully loaded. The Essex carriers were faster, with fuel capacity that allowed sustained operations far from base. They carried extensive spare parts and maintenance facilities that allowed them to repair aircraft at sea. They embarked replacement pilots to replace combat losses without returning to port. Most importantly, Essex-class carriers were built around an operational philosophy completely different from Japanese thinking. American doctrine viewed carriers as mobile air bases that would operate continuously for months. Japanese doctrine viewed carriers as strike weapons that would be concentrated for decisive battle, then withdrawn for refitting. The American approach required capacity for sustained operations. The Japanese approach prioritized short-term striking power. This philosophical difference manifested in every aspect of carrier design. Essex-class carriers had massive aviation fuel capacity, approximately 238,000 gallons, allowing sustained flight operations for weeks without refueling. Japanese carriers carried less fuel relative to their size, requiring frequent replenishment from tankers. Essex carriers had extensive maintenance facilities, including machine shops that could fabricate replacement parts. Japanese carriers had limited maintenance capability, depending on shore facilities for major repairs. Essex carriers embarked spare aircraft that could replace combat losses. A typical Essex air group included operational aircraft plus approximately 10 to 15% spares. This meant that losses during sustained operations could be replaced from the ship's own inventory without returning to base. Japanese carriers embarked minimal spares due to hangar space limitations, meaning combat losses depleted air group strength with no immediate replacement capability. The impact became apparent during sustained operations. An Essex-class carrier could launch strikes daily for weeks, replacing combat losses from spare aircraft and replacement pilots brought aboard from escort carriers or transferred from other fleet carriers. Japanese carriers could sustain intensive operations for several days before combat losses and mechanical attrition reduced air groups below effective strength, requiring withdrawal for replenishment. By June 1944, when the American fleet approached the Marianas, the disparity had become overwhelming. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher included 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, Lexington, Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Enterprise from the pre-war program, and 8 light carriers of the Independence class built on cruiser hulls. The combined air strength exceeded 900 aircraft. Vice Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet included 9 carriers, fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, light carriers Junyo, Hio, and Ryuho, light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. Total aircraft embarked approximately 450, but operational strength on June 19 was lower due to maintenance issues and pilot shortages. Approximately 375 aircraft were actually combat-ready. The numerical disparity was severe, but numbers alone understated the real gap. American pilots averaged approximately 300 hours of training before joining combat squadrons. Japanese pilots in mid-1944 averaged less than 100 hours due to fuel shortages and compressed training programs. American aircraft included F-6F Hellcats that outperformed the Zero in speed, armament, and durability. Japanese forces still relied primarily on the A-6M0, an aircraft designed in the late 1930s that was increasingly outmatched. American carriers operated with comprehensive radar coverage, providing detection of incoming raids at over 100 miles. Japanese carriers had limited radar, with detection ranges measured in tens of miles rather than hundreds. American fighter direction officers vectored combat air patrol to optimal intercept positions using radar data. Japanese combat air patrol relied on visual detection and patrol patterns that proved inadequate against coordinated American strikes. The systemic advantages meant that American carriers could conduct offensive operations while defending effectively against Japanese strikes. Japanese carriers struggled to defend themselves while also mounting offensive strikes, forcing them to choose between offense and defense rather than conducting both simultaneously as American doctrine intended. The morning of June 19 began with American radar detecting Japanese scout aircraft at extended range. The scouts were searching for American carriers, attempting to locate targets for the massive strike Ozawa planned to launch. American Combat Air Patrol intercepted and shot down several scouts before they could report American positions accurately. This seemingly minor advantage would prove decisive. Ozawa launched his strikes based on incomplete information about American locations and strength. The first Japanese strike wave departed at 0830 hours. 69 aircraft, primarily Zeros and Judy dive bombers, formed up and headed toward the estimated American position. Ozawa's plan depended on his aircraft's superior range, allowing strikes from distances where American aircraft could not effectively retaliate. The Japanese aircraft had been designed for extended range operations. The Zero could fly over 1,600 miles with drop tanks. American Hellcats had shorter range, approximately 1,000 miles with external tanks. This range advantage was real, but it was also the last meaningful advantage Japanese naval aviation possessed. Everything else had shifted decisively in America's favor. At 09:15 hours, American radar detected the incoming strike at over 140 miles distance. Fighter direction officers aboard the carriers immediately began vectoring combat air patrol to prison intercept positions. Hellcats climbed to altitude, positioning themselves to attack the Japanese formation from above with speed and altitude advantage. The Americans had nearly an hour of warning. 60 minutes to position fighters, prepare anti-aircraft guns, and maneuver ships into defensive formation. The Japanese strike leaders had no indication they had been detected until Hellcats appeared overhead, diving through their formations with devastating effect. The coordinated defense shattered the Japanese strike before it could reach attack range. Of 69 aircraft in the first wave, only 27 survived to return to their carriers. Not one scored a hit on American ships. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Ozawa launched a second wave at 0:56 hours. 129 aircraft, the largest strike the mobile fleet would launch that day. American radar detected this formation at 09:15 hours while it was still forming up over Japanese carriers. The Americans knew a major strike was inbound more than an hour before it would arrive. Fighter directors scrambled additional combat air patrol and positioned forces for optimal intercepts. The second wave received the same treatment as the first. Hellcats, vectored by radar guidance, intercepted the formation at extended range. The Japanese strike leaders found themselves under attack by fighters that seemed to know exactly where they would be and at what altitude. Formations were broken up by coordinated attacks from multiple directions. 97 Japanese aircraft were shot down, 6 damaged American ships with near misses and minor hits. None were critically damaged. Captain Jennings aboard Lexington watched the defensive battle unfold on radar screens in the Combat Information Center. The electronic displays showed Japanese formations as they approached. American fighters appeared as clusters of returns, vectoring to intercept positions. The entire battle was visible on radar long before any aircraft came within visual range. This situational awareness gave American commanders complete control over the defensive battle. Japanese commanders had no equivalent capability, making decisions based on fragmentary radio reports from strike leaders who were themselves under attack and unable to assess the overall tactical picture. The third Japanese strike departed at 1000 hours, 47 aircraft attempting to find and attack American carriers. Only 20 survived the gauntlet of radar-directed fighters and intensive anti-aircraft fire. The fourth strike, launched at 1300 hours with 82 aircraft, suffered even worse losses. 73 were shot down. By day's end, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft in combat. These losses were not simply numerical, they represented the effective destruction of Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. The pilots lost were irreplaceable veterans who could not be replaced given Japanese training capacity. The aircraft lost exceeded Japanese monthly production rates. The tactical defeat was absolute, but the true revelation came in the analysis of what American carriers had achieved while conducting this defensive battle. USS Lexington CV-16, Captain Jennings' ship, had launched defensive patrols throughout the day while simultaneously preparing offensive strikes. The flight deck operations that morning had embarked and launched 103 aircraft between 0730 and 0900 hours, 36 Hellcat fighters for combat air patrol, 37 Helldiver dive bombers armed with 1,000-pound bombs, 30 Avenger torpedo bombers carrying either torpedoes or additional bombs. This represented the largest single-ship strike launched in naval history to that point. 103 aircraft from a carrier that had been commissioned just 18 months earlier. The strike departed in coordinated waves, with fighters providing escort for bombers. The entire launch sequence took 90 minutes. By 0900 hours, Lexington's entire offensive strike was airborne and formed up, heading toward Japanese carrier positions. The mathematics of this achievement were staggering. 103 aircraft launched from a single deck, measuring 872 feet long and 147 feet wide at its maximum. The flight deck crew had positioned, armed, fueled, and launched aircraft at a rate of more than 1 per minute, sustained over 90 minutes. This required coordination among hundreds of personnel working in teams that functioned with precision that would have seemed impossible to observers from just 5 years earlier. The achievement became even more remarkable when compared to Japanese carrier operations that same morning. Taiho, Ozawa's flagship and Japan's newest fleet carrier, had launched 63 aircraft as part of the combined strikes. This represented her maximum operational capacity. The carrier could physically embark more aircraft, but operational limitations in maintenance, fuel capacity, and pilot availability meant 63 was the practical maximum she could launch and sustain. Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier engagement of the war, launched similar numbers. Approximately 60 to 70 aircraft each, representing their full operational capacity. The 3 fleet carriers combined launched fewer aircraft than Lexington alone had put into the air that morning. This disparity revealed the fundamental difference in how the two nations approached carrier aviation. The Essex-class design emphasized sustained operations with large air groups that could be maintained at sea for extended periods. Every aspect of the ship's design supported this goal. The hangar deck measured 584 feet long and 70 feet wide, with 18-foot overhead clearance. This provided space for aircraft storage, maintenance, and pre-flight preparation. 2 centerline elevators and 1 deck-edge elevator moved aircraft between hangar and flight deck at rates that allowed rapid launch and recovery cycles. The flight deck itself incorporated design features that maximized operational efficiency. 2 hydraulic catapults assisted aircraft launches, allowing heavily loaded bombers to reach flying speed in the limited deck run available. 4 arresting cables stretched across the landing area, providing multiple opportunities for landing aircraft to catch a wire and stop safely. Crash barriers could be raised to protect aircraft forward on the deck if a landing aircraft missed all arresting wires. Aviation fuel systems were comprehensive and redundant. Storage tanks held 238,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. Distribution lines ran throughout the ship, allowing simultaneous refueling of multiple aircraft. Fire suppression systems included foam generators and CO2 flooding capability. Fuel handling procedures emphasized safety while maximizing speed, allowing rapid turnaround between landing and launching aircraft. Ammunition magazines stored thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition for aircraft machine guns, hundreds of thousand-pound bombs, dozens of torpedoes, and depth charges. Elevators and handling systems moved ordnance from magazines to flight deck with speed that allowed armament of entire strike groups in under an hour. Ordnance crews could arm 36 fighters, 37 dive bombers, and 30 torpedo bombers in the time it took for the first waves to be spotted on deck and prepared for launch. Maintenance facilities aboard Essex-class carriers exceeded those of most shore installations. Machine shops could fabricate replacement parts. Electronics shops repaired radar and radio equipment. Engine shops overhauled power plants. Structural repair shops could patch battle damage or rebuild damaged airframes. This capability meant that aircraft damaged in combat or through operational accidents could be repaired aboard ship rather than requiring evacuation to shore facilities. The crew complement reflected the massive support structure required for sustained air operations: 2,600 officers and enlisted men. Of these, approximately 1,000 were directly involved in aviation operations. Flight deck crews, hangar deck crews, maintenance personnel, ordnance handlers, fuel handlers, catapult crews, arresting gear crews, aircraft elevator operators. Another 1,000 operated the ship itself. Engineering personnel maintaining propulsion machinery. Damage control teams. Navigation and communications personnel. Gunners manning anti-aircraft batteries. Japanese carriers operated with smaller crews relative to their size. Taiho embarked approximately 1,650 officers and men. This smaller crew reflected Japanese design philosophy that emphasized crew efficiency over redundancy. Every man had specific duties with minimal overlap. This worked well under normal conditions, but created vulnerabilities when battle casualties depleted specialized personnel. The philosophical difference extended to pilot training and integration. Essex-class carriers operated as training platforms as well as combat units. Replacement pilots joined the air group while the ship was at sea, flying training missions to build experience before participating in combat operations. Experienced pilots rotated back to the United States after completing combat tours, their expertise used to train new pilots who would eventually join fleet squadrons. This rotation system meant that while individual pilot experience declined from pre-war levels, the average squadron maintained adequate skill levels by mixing experienced veterans with newer pilots. Japanese carriers had no equivalent replacement system. Pilots joined air groups during workup periods before deployment. Once the carrier deployed, the air group remained intact until the deployment ended or until losses depleted the squadron below effective strength. There was no rotation of experienced pilots back to training commands. Every experienced pilot lost in combat was gone permanently from the training pipeline, unable to pass knowledge to new pilots. By mid-1944, this system had collapsed under cumulative losses. Japanese pilot training programs had been forced to abbreviate curricula due to fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at fleet squadrons with less than 100 hours total flight time, compared to 300 to 500 hours for American pilots. The experience gap meant that Japanese pilots were increasingly outmatched in combat, leading to higher loss rates that further depleted the experienced pilot pool. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated this disparity with mathematical precision. American Combat Air Patrol shot down Japanese aircraft at exchange rates exceeding 10-to-1. Experienced American pilots in superior aircraft with radar guidance engaged inexperienced Japanese pilots in aircraft that were increasingly obsolete. The outcome was never in doubt once the engagement began. But the battle revealed more than just combat effectiveness. It revealed that American industrial capacity had created a carrier force that operated on completely different principles from Japanese thinking. One Essex-class carrier could project more air power than Japan's finest fleet carrier. America had built 24 Essex-class carriers by war's end. Japan never built more than 2 fleet carriers of any single class. The production statistics told the story of industrial capacity applied to naval warfare. Essex CV-9 commissioned December 31, 1942. Yorktown CV-10 commissioned April 15, 1943. Intrepid CV, Olvendines commissioned August 16, 1943. Hornet CV, 12-2 commissioned November 29, 1943. Franklin CV-13, commissioned January 31, 1944. Lexington CV-16, commissioned February 17, 1943. Bunker Hill CV-17 commissioned May 25, 1943. Wasp CV-18 commissioned November 24, 1943. Hancock CV-19 commissioned April 15, 1944. Bennington CV-20 commissioned August 6, 1944. Boxer CV-21 commissioned April 16, 1945. The list continued through CV-32, though 8 planned ships were canceled after Japanese surrender made their completion unnecessary. 24 Essex-class carriers were completed and commissioned. 17 saw combat in World War II. The remaining 7 commissioned too late for combat operations, but served in the immediate post-war period. This production represented industrial achievement unprecedented in naval history. No nation had ever built so many large warships so quickly. No nation had ever committed the resources necessary to sustain such construction while simultaneously producing hundreds of other ships across all categories. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 47,000 tons of steel. Hull plating, structural members, deck plating, all fabricated to precise specifications. 24 carriers meant over 1 million tons of steel shaped into carrier hulls. This figure excluded the steel required for propulsion machinery, electrical systems, and equipment. The total steel consumption for the Essex program exceeded 1.5 million tons. The propulsion machinery represented another industrial triumph. Each carrier required 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines. Each turbine was a precision instrument weighing hundreds of tons, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. 96 turbines, total for 24 ships. Each carrier required 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers. 192 boilers total, each capable of generating steam at 600 pounds per square inch and temperatures exceeding 850 degrees Fahrenheit. Electrical systems included generators producing enough power to supply a small city. Miles of electrical cable distributed power throughout each ship. Thousands of electrical motors operated everything from aircraft elevators to steering gear to ventilation systems. The electrical installation alone in each Essex-class carrier exceeded the total electrical capacity of many destroyers. The scale of construction required mobilization of American industrial capacity that seemed impossible when the program began. Shipyards expanded massively. Newport News Shipbuilding employed over 31,000 workers at peak. Bethlehem Steel's Fore River Yard employed similar numbers. Workers operated in 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days per week. Construction never stopped except for extreme weather or equipment failure. Subcontractors across America produced components that were shipped to assembly yards. Westinghouse plants in Pennsylvania manufactured turbines. Babcock and Wilcox plants produced boilers. Thousands of smaller suppliers provided valves, pumps, electrical components, fasteners, and specialized equipment. The supply chain stretched across the entire country, coordinated through procurement offices that managed contracts worth billions of dollars. Japanese carrier construction could not match this pace or scale. Japan completed 6 fleet carriers during the war. Taiho, commissioned March 1944. Shinano, converted from Yamato-class battleship hull, commissioned November 1944. Unryu, commissioned August 1944. Amagi, commissioned August 1944. Katsuragi, commissioned October 1944. Kasagi, construction halted incomplete. These 6 carriers represented Japan's maximum construction capability, while simultaneously building surface combatants and merchantmen to replace catastrophic losses. Japanese shipyards simply lacked the capacity to expand production beyond this rate. Steel allocation was limited. Skilled labor was scarce. Manufacturing capacity for specialized components like turbines and boilers was insufficient to support accelerated construction. The mathematical implications were devastating. America added 24 fleet carriers during the war. Japan added 6. America's carriers embarked 90 to 100 aircraft each. Japan's new carriers embarked 60 to 75 aircraft when fully loaded. America's carriers operated with comprehensive maintenance facilities and large crews that allowed sustained operations. Japan's carriers operated with minimal maintenance capability and smaller crews that limited operational endurance. The compound effect meant that American carrier striking power increased exponentially during the war, while Japanese carrier power declined absolutely. By mid-1944, American carriers operated with impunity throughout the Pacific. Japanese carriers were reduced to defensive operations, unable to challenge American control of the airspace around invasion fleets. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, demonstrated the complete reversal of carrier power. Vice Admiral Ozawa commanded Japanese carrier forces built around 4 carriers: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The combined air groups totaled 108 aircraft, but only 29 were actually combat-ready due to pilot shortages and maintenance issues. The carriers functioned as decoys rather than striking forces, their mission to draw American carriers away from the main Japanese surface force approaching Leyte Gulf. American carrier forces included 6 Essex-class carriers and 8 light carriers, over 1,000 aircraft. The disparity was so severe that Ozawa's force was essentially sacrificial, intended to distract American attention rather than engage in meaningful combat. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk by American airstrikes on October 25. The token air groups they embarked achieved nothing of tactical significance. The engagement marked the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a meaningful force. Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, sank on October 25, taking with her the last remnants of the naval aviation culture that had dominated the Pacific in 1941 and 42. No Japanese carriers participated in combat operations for the remainder of the war. The carriers that survived lacked fuel, aircraft, and pilots to operate effectively. The Essex-class carriers continued operations through the final months of the war. They struck targets throughout the Philippines. They supported the invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945. They supported the Okinawa invasion in April through June. They struck the Japanese home islands repeatedly from July through August, their aircraft ranging over Japan with impunity that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The final strikes came on August 15, 1945. Essex-class carriers launched attacks against targets in northern Honshu even as Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast was being transmitted. The strikes were recalled in flight when news of the surrender reached the carriers. Aircraft returned to their ships, marking the end of carrier operations that had lasted nearly 4 years. The statistical record of Essex-class operations revealed the scale of air power these ships had projected. USS Essex CV-16 steamed over 300,000 miles during the war, conducting operations that destroyed or damaged hundreds of Japanese aircraft and dozens of ships. USS Yorktown CV-10 participated in every major carrier operation from August 1943 through war's end. USS Intrepid CV-11 survived multiple kamikaze hits, demonstrating the survivability built into Essex-class design. USS Lexington CV-16, the ship that had launched 103 aircraft on June 19, 1944, became the most decorated carrier of the war. She participated in every major Central Pacific operation, Her aircraft destroyed over 500 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. They sank or damaged over 60 Japanese ships. The carrier survived multiple attacks, including bomb hits that would have sunk earlier carriers with less comprehensive damage control capability. The human cost of these operations was significant. Essex-class carriers lost hundreds of aircraft to combat and operational accidents. Thousands of aircrew died in action or were listed as missing. But the carriers brought most of their crews home safely. The ships proved remarkably survivable against damage that would have proven fatal to earlier carriers, or to Japanese carriers built with less emphasis on damage control and survivability. USS Franklin CV-16 demonstrated Essex-class survivability when she was struck by 2 bombs on March 19, 1945, while operating off Japan. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck, where fully armed and fueled aircraft were being prepared for launch. The resulting fires and explosions killed 724 crew members and wounded 265 more. The damage was catastrophic. The ship was dead in the water, listing, with fires raging throughout the hangar deck and threatening magazines. But Franklin did not sink. Damage control parties contained the fires. Engineering crews restored partial power. The ship eventually steamed under her own power back to the United States, covering 12,000 miles with damage that would have sent most ships to the bottom. The survival demonstrated that Essex-class carriers were built to absorb tremendous punishment and remain operational. No Japanese carrier demonstrated equivalent survivability. Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, sank on June 19, 1944, from a single torpedo hit. The torpedo ruptured aviation fuel lines. Inadequate damage control allowed fuel vapors to spread throughout the ship. Hours after the initial hit, an electrical spark ignited the accumulated vapors. The resulting explosion blew out the hangar deck and sides of the ship. Taiho sank rapidly, taking 1,648 crew members with her. The contrast illustrated fundamental differences in design philosophy. American carriers were built with multiple redundancies, compartmentalization that limited damage spread, and damage control systems that emphasized crew survival and ship preservation. Japanese carriers were built with minimal redundancy, limited compartmentalization, and damage control capabilities that proved inadequate when facing severe battle damage. These differences reflected divergent assumptions about carrier warfare. American planners assumed carriers would absorb damage and needed to survive to fight again. Japanese planners assumed carriers would avoid damage through superior tactics and needed maximum striking power rather than survivability. Both assumptions were tested in combat. The American assumption proved correct. The Japanese assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The post-war analysis of carrier operations revealed the extent to which American industrial and organizational superiority had decided the Pacific War's outcome. Japan began the war with carriers that were individually comparable to American carriers. Some, like Shokaku and Zuikaku, were arguably superior in certain respects. But Japan could not replace losses. Japan could not expand the carrier force rapidly during wartime. Japan could not sustain large air groups with adequate pilot training and maintenance support. America could do all of these things. The Essex-class program demonstrated industrial capacity applied to naval warfare at scales that Japan simply could not match. 24 fleet carriers completed in less than 3 years, each carrying 90 to 100 aircraft, each supported by industrial infrastructure that provided replacement aircraft, replacement pilots, spare parts, and everything necessary for sustained combat operations. The revelation that a single Essex-class carrier could launch more aircraft than Japan's finest fleet carrier could embark was not simply a tactical observation. It was proof that American industrial superiority had created fundamental asymmetries in combat capability. One American carrier could do what required multiple Japanese carriers. America had dozens of such carriers. Japan had fewer carriers that were themselves individually inferior in operational capacity. Japanese naval officers who survived the war understood what had happened. Captain Toshikazu Omai, whose wartime intelligence analysis had correctly identified American technological advantages early in the conflict, wrote extensively about carrier operations in post-war analysis. His assessment was that Japanese carrier aviation had been defeated not through lack of courage or poor tactics, but through systematic industrial and organizational inferiority that made individual battles increasingly unwinnable as the war progressed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the war, co-authored the definitive Japanese analysis of Midway and subsequent carrier operations. His central conclusion was that Japan had entered the war with a finite carrier capability that could not be expanded or replaced once losses began. America had entered the war with carrier capability that expanded exponentially during the conflict. The mathematical implications of this disparity made Japan's defeat inevitable once initial tactical advantages were exhausted. The final image of American carrier dominance came in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Multiple Essex-class carriers lay at anchor, their aircraft flying overhead in formations that demonstrated complete air supremacy. USS Lexington, the carrier that had launched 103 aircraft on June 19, 1944, was among them. Her crew lined the rails watching the surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri. The ceremony marked the formal end of the Pacific War. But for those who understood carrier operations, the war had been decided much earlier. It had been decided when American shipyards began completing Essex-class carriers every 6 weeks. It had been decided when American training programs began producing pilots faster than Japan could train replacements. It had been decided when American industrial capacity created carrier forces that could sustain operations indefinitely, while Japanese forces exhausted themselves through attrition. The comparison between one Essex-class carrier launching 103 aircraft and Taiho embarking 63 aircraft was not simply a numerical disparity. It was the physical manifestation of industrial warfare's logic. The nation with greater industrial capacity, better organizational systems, and more comprehensive approach to naval aviation had built carriers that individually outmatched enemy equivalents while simultaneously building more of them. Japanese naval planners in 1941 had calculated that numerical inferiority could be offset through superior training, better tactics, and technological advantages like the Long Lance torpedo and the Zero fighter. These calculations assumed rough parity in industrial capacity and organizational effectiveness. The assumptions were wrong. American industrial capacity was not roughly equal to Japanese capacity. It was an order of magnitude greater. American organizational effectiveness was not comparable. It was systematically superior across every dimension, from pilot training to logistics to ship construction. By June 1944, when Lexington launched 103 aircraft in 90 minutes, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Japanese forces fought on with determination that earned respect from their enemies. But determination could not overcome systematic inferiority in every dimension that mattered for modern warfare. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor had been sunk or rendered ineffective. The pilots who had flown those strikes were dead or grounded by lack of aircraft. The industrial base that had built Japan's pre-war navy could not replace losses or expand the fleet during wartime. America's Essex-class carriers symbolized the inevitable outcome of industrial total war. 24 ships, each capable of projecting more air power than Japan's finest carrier, operating continuously across the Pacific, striking targets thousands of miles from base, absorbing damage that would sink lesser ships, bringing their crews home. These carriers represented not just technological achievement, but systematic industrial and organizational superiority that Japan could never match regardless of tactical skill or individual courage. The revelation came gradually to Japanese naval officers. First, confusion at American recovery speed after Midway. Then concern at American carrier numbers in 1943. Then shock at Essex-class capabilities in 1944. Finally, acceptance that the war had been lost not in any single battle, but in the shipyards and factories and training centers where American industrial power had been systematically mobilized for victory. Captain Jennings, standing on Lexington's bridge on June 19, 1944, watching 103 aircraft form up overhead, could not have known the full historical significance of what his ship had achieved. But he understood enough. America had built carriers that changed the fundamental nature of naval warfare. Those carriers were arriving in the Pacific in numbers that overwhelmed all opposition. The outcome was no longer in question. Only the duration remained uncertain. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.